Hi, thanks for coming to another of the videos in the Sewing and Learning workshop series at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. My name is Amy Huffnagel. I'm the Director of Programs and Visitor Experience at the Stowe Center, and I am joined today with Rebecca Bayreuther Donohue, who is working with us on this project now for 3 years. Rebecca, right? So glad to have you on board as a maker who specializes in reproduction, historical working wardrobes, knitwear, and the links between textiles and artists from the past. And in our work, you work with us creating the patterns and the information and the how-to kits that accompany our learning today. Rebecca is also the co-founder of an experiential learning collective called Dirty Blue Shirts. I'll put the link in the chat. But Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us today, and I look forward to you walking us through our kit and your process as you worked with us on this project.
Great. Well, Amy, thank you so much for inviting me back. It is always a pleasure to work with the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center and the really exciting and innovative work that you folks are doing. So glad to be a part of it. This, as Amy mentioned, was a really different and interesting process because unlike the first two presentations, we were not recreating something extant in the collection. We were taking a concept and bringing it into physical form. So I had, for my own part, to really think about how to do this in a very different way than taking a historical object, discovering how it was created, and then looking at how we as makers today could take the lessons that it teaches and bring them into our lives by recreating an object like this. This workshop talks about recreating, if you will, or creating in the first place, a concept linked to the words specifically of Harriet Beecher Stowe. So it took me really thinking about what that meant and how taking her words and getting them somehow on fabric in terms of sewing textiles for change, what that could mean in a physical form. So we had some really amazing conversations amongst the group of women who are contributing to this workshop today. And I think we've come up with a really exciting project for you. So I'm going to walk you through the kit that we have for you to work with and a little bit about how to work with the ingredients in it. And then because this is very much, the product of this workshop is going to be very much your own creation, I'll just give you a couple of ideas of how I worked with the ingredients in the kit to get what I was hoping to do. So you will all receive in the mail this beautiful packet, and I believe, Amy, that they'll be available in the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center store if you are looking at this after the workshops are over with. And within this tiny, fabulous packet by Tatter Blue Libraries, you get a booklet with the instructions. So we'll go over some of those later. What I want to draw your attention to right off is the first page of that booklet is a template that we'll be using with a couple of the other ingredients in the kit, with a quote from Harriet and a copy of her signature. And these have been blocked out on graph paper, so you can size them any way you want. If you don't like the size that they are now, you can, blow them up or shrink them down as you will. So we have Harriet's own words in her own handwriting. After the instructions, we've got several pages of instructions and embroidery tips. But after that, we have more quotes from Harriet's works, and a lot of different works, letters, her extant texts, pieces from her books, all chosen to be particularly inspirational in terms of agency and activism. So if you are looking for more projects than just the one that involves the quote at the beginning of the booklet, you can take any of these. And if you don't want to use the quote at the beginning, you can take any of these right now and embroider them or graph them out however you will. So that, in short, is the content of the booklet. Along with that booklet in the packet, you get 3 12 by 12 squares of amazing cloth. So the first one is a nice open weave linen cloth that you can see. It's got a nice coarse weave to it, so very useful, particularly for cross stitch. And counted cross stitch tends to be the medium in which we find a lot of 19th and 18th century embroideries that involve texts. So we have, with that, for use with the counted cross stitch fabric, we have a template of alphabets and a couple of little borders from the Workwoman's Guide, which may be very familiar to some of you as being one of the oldest extant guides for embroidery and all kinds of textile work with really complete instructions for the lay person. So somebody who's not trained in, for instance, an embroidery guild in London or some such. So real people putting these into real practices, like marking linen that's going out to be washed and needs to get back to the right people. So several different alphabets here. On the back of the template, for those who prefer freehand embroidery, who aren't so fond maybe of counted cross stitch, or who want to combine the two, as I do in my example, we've got the Thomsonian cursive alphabet that many of us grew up using in school, and then a Spencerian alphabet, which is more like the alphabet that Harriet Beecher Stowe may have been taught in her schooling as a child. So, excellent things to use on your 2 other fabrics. One of them, you've got your counted cross stitch fabric. You also have a plain, beautiful piece of percale white cotton made in India. And this is sheer enough so that you can place it over any of the templates that we provide, be it Harriet's signature. This is just so you can see, even without a great light behind it, it doesn't show up fantastically here in my poor light, but it is sheer enough so that you can see the signature beneath it, or any of the templates, any of the cursive alphabets, basically anything that you want, as long as it's dark enough. If you want to freehand something, you can make sure that it's in a nice thick line, like a black Sharpie on a nice clean white piece of paper. And this fabric is sheer enough to lay on top of it, and you can trace it out. I used, again, this is really faint in my terrible light, but I used a pencil to start tracing Harriet's signature from the booklet, but Tedder was so clever as to include in their packet a marker pen. And this marker pen can be used on really any of the fabrics that we have. You know, if you're going to use it on a fabric that you are providing, it's a good idea to test it in a corner or on a little scrap of it before you commit. But the joy of this, and I'm going to show you on a piece of paper here, is that you can right in the blue part of the pen. And then the other half of it is an eraser. And all it really is like a water pen. It's sort of damp. So it gives you the ability to really fine tune the lines. So if you write out from a template on fabric, and then you realize that your embroidery isn't going to cover all of it, you can see I've kind of scribbled over the H and the A in Harriet, and it's a little damp, but that'll dry out, and that takes away the writing of the pen. So if you want, you can also wash your fabric, but again, it's a good idea if you're using mixed media to test that before you really commit to washing an entire project to get rid of a couple, sort of faded blue lines. So word to the wise. So you have your pen, you've got your templates, and you also have the final piece of fabric is an amazing 12 by 12 square of antique linen fabric, hand woven, and I believe hand spun in Romania. So this fabric that came with my packet has, it was obviously cut from a larger piece, and you can see where two pieces here have been joined, hand sewn, just sort of whipped, edge to edge to make it a bigger piece. So it was really special to find that and think about the person who might have done that, and for what purpose, so that brings up a whole other layer of thought about textiles and how, handmade they are. So you've got a lot of options with your 3 fabrics, your templates. We give you in the kit a piece of graph paper so that you can, graph things out. It's a really good idea if you're doing anything with counted cross stitch or, a very regimented alphabet where it has to be a certain size. It's a really good idea to work up some kind of spatial arrangement for those. So this is a look at what I did for my example. So I took some time to decide which of the alphabets I wanted to use, and I just transferred them onto a piece of graph paper. And then I counted out how high the letters are and how wide the phrase was that I wanted to use. And that gives you an idea of how much room that you're going to take up with these. My initial idea for my project was to center all of my phrases, one on top of the other. The process went kind of organically, so it's not perfect, and I'm not going to sweat it because it's the words that are the most meaningful part of this project after all. So the coup de grace for the whole project, what's going to absolutely blow you out of the water, is these beautiful hand-dyed embroidery threads that Tatter made and provided along with 2 embroidery needles here so that you can make your embroidery all of these amazing, tremendous colors. I did not have this when I did my examples, so I wish I had, because these are so beautiful. So you guys are really, really lucky. What it's easiest to do is take a strand of embroidery floss, which is usually 6-stranded. This is 6-stranded, and a lot of commercial brands are now. It's easiest to work in short pieces because you're not going to use all 6 strands at once. So I tend to hold a piece in my between my thumb and finger and kind of measure it down my arm. And so you really don't want it, you know, much longer than a foot and a half. And I'm just going to cut a piece there, put the rest of mine aside, and you're going to sort of twizzle the ends apart so you can see each of those tiny strands. You see how it's coming apart? So what I used for my cross stitch project was 3 strands for the counted cross stitch alphabets, and then I'm using 1 for the signature, for the embroidery on the percale. So I've just twizzled that ply in half, so there's 3 in each. And if you've got a short enough strand, you can usually sort of pull them apart and it'll come, you know, sort of apart by itself, sort of brilliantly like that. They're going to kind of twizzle up, and you can you know, put a little tension on the end in order to get it to twizzle apart cleanly. And then you've got 2 working strands. If you're, like I said, if you're going to do the counted cross stitch. And as we go over in the instruction packet too, you can decide how much weight you want to put on a line. Maybe you want to play with emphasizing a part of your text by making, stitching it out of 3 strands and everything else in 2, or maybe you want to make that emphasis in colors. It's really not going to matter because it's whatever you do that makes your point. So when it comes to the cross stitching itself, we're not going to use any knots. So what I'm going to do is I'm showing you the back of this fabric right now. I'm just going to choose one of the little holes, and instead of using a knot, you can see I'm just going to keep an inch or so of tail, and I'm going to hold that with one of my fingers while I complete the X of the fabric. And I'm just going to kind of peek over the top of the counted cross stitch fabric so that you can see, so that I can see that I'm catching that tail within the loop of the first stitch. So that's going to be pretty easy to make sure that the stitch isn't going to go anywhere. And if you do more in a line, you know, that tail will get nice and stitched down. You can always go back and trim them later, or, you know, chances are nobody's going to see the back of it. So if that doesn't mean a great deal to your finished product, you don't have to worry about it. If the threads aren't going to come out, that's the main deal. So when it comes to the embroidery, similar thing here. I've started embroidering on the percale Harriet's name. Instead of the counted cross stitch X's, I'm using just a kind of a back stitch where I'm just taking really short little stitches. You can see they're, you know, maybe they're less than 1/4 of an inch because her the loops in her letters get pretty small, and I wanted that ability to get pretty small as well. So I'm just going out and then sort of backtracking with my stitches and coming up about the same length away at the next part of the line. So embroidery is pretty free form. There's lots of names for lots of different stitches. If you're cognizant with those, have a great time. If you're not, we can certainly talk through them more, or there are lots of great videos on YouTube as well. Basically, as long as you're inspired, you're doing a great job. So I think that runs basically through everything that we have in the kit. I'll show you my example. And I will say this has been a really interesting project. I talked a little bit about how different it was from the other projects that we've done. And I wanted to be really mindful of that. I tried to be very conscious of every decision that I was privileged to be a part of, whether it was choosing the quote that you have in the booklet that comes with the embroidery templates and materials, or the quote that I chose for my own example as well. And part of that was because I had an idea of how long it was going to take to put these words on fabric. So the quote that I chose is one of those in the booklet further on that Harriet wrote in a letter to her brother, Henry Ward Beecher. And this spoke to me just from my past experience. I liked it. It was kind of an instinctual yes. And so I tried not to overthink it and just went with it. A more conscious decision was that I wanted to try out all the different alphabets on the counted cross stitch template from the Workwoman's Guide. You know, I've got a lot of experience with counted cross stitch. When I was doing my women's studies as an undergrad, I reproduced, I designed an 18th century sampler and reproduced it with all the different historic needlework techniques that I could find at the time. So I thought going into this that I knew how much time it was going to take to do this. And it's been a while since university, so I found out I was really wrong, that it was going to take a lot more time, even with my experience. So what it meant, and you can see the different alphabets here, but I'm going to bring this a little closer to the camera so you can see the red fire away is not done in the typical counted cross stitch X's, but in eyelet stitch. And that's why that alphabet looks different on your template from all the others. So the eyelet stitch, basically eyelets, are a form of a buttonhole, if you will, but mostly used for lacing on 18th and 19th and much earlier century garments. And it uses about 4 times the spacing of a counted cross stitch X. So it wound up, I knew I wanted to emphasize this particular phrase because it was emphasized in Harriet's letter itself, but I had severely underestimated the amount of time and the amount of space that it would take up. So knowing I wanted to emphasize it by using the bright red, it got sort of triply emphasized by the sheer size of the stitch, and also because of that, the time that it took to stitch it out. So with really every one of these phrases, and certainly the fire away, most of all, I really found myself thinking about not only each letter, but thinking about each phrase. It sort of became a refrain in my head as I worked through each line. So, Amy and I were talking about how at first I thought, oh, great, I'll get a lot of podcast listening done while I'm working on this. And certainly stitching while talking to each other is something that women makers do really well. But it was a really introspective process to hear these words in my head as I was putting them down on the textile. And they each acquired their own weight, which was really a special part of the process that I hadn't been anticipating. So with that, I think I would simply recommend that you, as the designer, as the maker, because you're not making a specific thing, you're the designer as well as the maker, take all the time that you need to design it. If you don't get to making the object during our workshop, that's fine. Maybe you just want to sit and listen to the incredible lectures that we have combined in this workshop. This is going to mean something really special to you. So, take your time, go through the design process. Don't overthink things too much. It's okay to use your instincts. But this was a really marvelous project, and I'm glad that you're all here with us.